All right. Good morning, everyone. We're moving into chapter 11 today, looking at photosynthesis and respiration. And as with a lot of this unit, we've already touched on a lot of these things, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into detail. Big thing here on chapter 11, when we get into this photosynthesis, a lot of it is going to be pretty chemically relevant, and some of it's going to be probably a little bit over your head. I know it's a little bit over my head still after studying this thing for a long time. So again, I'm not concerned about you guys remembering every little part about the energy transfer. Excuse me, just the key concepts of photosynthesis, energy transfer, and respiration. So we'll get into that again. If you guys have any questions, you want to know more about these processes, I'm happy to share more with you. But for time's sake and really to cover the material, I think that we'll kind of be sort of brief on some of this stuff. So let's get into it. Let me share my screen here. All right, you guys see the PowerPoint there?
Yep.
All right. Well, first, you guys all know about photosynthesis, and we touched on the carbon cycle too, and we had a little bit of a test question there where we were talking about the difference in the carbon cycle and photosynthesis. I just want to reaffirm that photosynthesis is just a part of the carbon cycle. It's a very important part of it, and it's kind of where it all begins, but it is not everything that has to do with the carbon cycle. There's a lot of other things going on there as well. So this graphic is just kind of showing a little bit of that. Again, we've got multiple types of respiration coming from animal organisms as well as plants, from roots, from biology in the soil as well. And of course, in our lives, in the realm of human beings, we have combustion of fuels, which also leads to some major inputs to the carbon cycle. So of course, again, review, all the organisms that photosynthesize are autotrophs. They produce energy. Those which cannot produce the energy are heterotrophs, and they have to consume autotrophs at some level. And I know that some people are out there like, well, I just eat meat and potatoes. Well, hey, then you're eating a plant, right? Even if you're just a pure carnivore, which I think biologically is impossible, you're still consuming food that came from an autotroph at some point because of the way that energy travels through organisms. So as long as we have equal or nearly equal amount of carbon being taken up by photosynthesis by plants as what is being respired and released, our atmospheric carbon dioxide levels do not vary. Of course, we all hear about the greenhouse effect as a result of carbon dioxide being released from the combustion, often of fossil fuels. That's not the only thing that leads to increased CO2 levels. We can also have carbon dioxide released simply from plowing soil. Of course, plants, being autotrophs, lead the role there in the carbon cycle. They begin it. And without our friends, the plants, no other life on planet Earth could survive. So the carbon cycle, of course, is based on carbon. And carbon is a very important element in its structure and the way that it can share bonds. Carbon can form up to 4 bonds. That would be with the most simple element, hydrogen. And each bond represents 2 electrons being shared between carbon and hydrogen, creating that bond. And we see these shared electrons as a short line connecting in a kind of chemistry notation. No other element has this ideal combination of the ability to share electrons plus the stability that results from these bonds that form. which makes carbon such an important element in life. And of course, we are all carbon-based life forms. On other planets, and in other galaxies, other star systems, they believe that there may be other life forms that are based on different elements. But for our purposes on planet Earth, basically every living thing is a carbon-based life form. It's the basis of a biochemical reaction in which the electron from one element or molecule is exchanged between another molecule. And we call these oxidation reduction reactions or redox reactions. And the basis here is that reduced compounds donate electrons to other compounds. And I put a little picture in there for us to kind of be able to refer back to. Basically, oxidation is losing an electron, reduction is gaining an electron. This transfer of electrons is what basically underlies all life on our planet itself. Carbon, of course, is at the center of this process because because of its bonding and its ability to share electrons, is the most versatile element at donating and accepting electrons. Photosynthesis is the process of converting that oxidized carbon in the form of CO2. You see it's got carbon and oxygen, therefore it's oxidized, to a reduced carbon carbohydrate. And the most simple form of that is carbon with water. Respiration, however, is the process of converting that reduced carbon to oxidized carbon to generate other forms of energy. Here's just the most simple chemical reaction written to represent photosynthesis, which is basically carbon dioxide, CO2, plus water, along with the catalyst being light here, to basically allow that energy from light to split up these molecules to where we get water to carbohydrate and molecular oxygen release. And in plants, this photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts. Chloroplasts, of course, contain the chlorophyll molecules. And here's just both a drawing, little sketch, as well as an electron micrograph of the chloroplast and kind of what is taking place inside of the chloroplast. And so we see that we have basically these membrane structures that are stacked on each other that are called these thylakoid structures. And they're basically responsible in moving the energy from carbon and oxygen to create chlorophyll and then eventually to respire, creating chemical energy. The chloroplast, of course, contains a complex array of these membranes we just mentioned called thylakoids that are surrounded by this thing called the stroma lamella, which in a way is sort of like a cell wall holding this light energy. Also within the thylakoid are many different proteins that each have their own unique role in metabolism and respiration, as well as just the growth of plants. We've got two photosystems here, photosystem 1 and 2, 1 being represented by a square and photosystem 2 being represented by a circle. And those basically, these different photosystems utilize the light energy and obtain the electrons from water and transfer them throughout these thylakoid membranes. And you can kind of see here that we have 4 hydrogen protons. Whenever we see that plus or minus symbol, that's referring to positively charged ion, a proton, and a negatively charged ion, which is an electron. The protons that are generated in this water splitting reaction create this gradient across these thylakoid membranes and moves these protons and electrons throughout. We also have, if we go back here to the image, this other circle, this ATP synthase, which is basically kind of the mechanism in which energy is transferred through photosynthesis. Then we have a reduced chemical that is formed through this process that is called nicotinamide dinucleotide phosphate, or that's the only time you'll hear me say that. The rest of the time we'll refer to it as NADPH. And the process of generating this NADPH is called the light reaction, which is that light-dependent step of photosynthesis. And then we take this energy from the NADPH and the ATP to use in other biochemical reactions in these steps to produce and synthesize carbohydrates to utilize in other forms of energy transfer. So this is just an illustration kind of that taking place, oxidized and reduced forms of NADPH, passing on electrons and protons in order to pass along energy. When we reduce carbon dioxide, it's in this thing called the Calvin cycle, which is basically just the carbon reduction cycle within plants. It does not require light, but it does depend on these light-required molecules, NADPH and ATP. The first reaction here is the attachment or the fixing of carbon dioxide to ribulose diphosphate, which again, we have carboxylation, we have hydrolysis. This is all organic chemistry. And again, I don't think it's extremely important to know or memorize how these reactions occur. You guys can do that in a biology class. It's just important to know that these are the mechanisms at which energy is transferred and in which CO2 and water are taken up and combined with light energy in order to form eventually carbohydrates. It becomes catalyzed by this enzyme, which is again another big name, ribulose diphosphate carboxylase, which we refer to as Rubisco. And we have two more reactions. So basically we just have this series, these chains of different reactions moving that energy into a form in which we can finally create sugars and carbohydrates that are able to be used for the raw materials for plants. So first, from the Calvin cycle, we produce glyceraldehyde, which is just a reduced form of glycerate. And then we use that to go through to regenerate the ribulose diphosphate so that we can fix more carbon dioxide. The remainder of the energy there is used to form glucose, which is our basic sugar. This one stable, high energy metabolite that basically everything else in the plant is based off of. Not just the source of energy for metabolism, but also the raw material for other metabolites and other chemicals within the plant. And of course, it can combine with other sugar molecules to form compounds, some of these which we've already talked about, such as sucrose, starches, and cellulose. Sucrose being the most common form of sugar transported in plants, which is also known as table sugar. And it is kind of a disaccharide that has both fructose and glucose molecules in it. Then we have starch and cellulose, which again are a little bit of review here, very similar molecules, just differently linked chains of glucose. Starch being really important for energy storage, such as in seeds or in tuberous roots of plants, also other storage mechanisms in plants, and also for humans for food, as well as other industrial uses. Cellulose, on the other hand, is the basis that makes up a lot of the plant tissues and also many of the fibers that we eat. And again, really the main difference there is just how these glucose molecules are bonded together. And for the synthesis, there's a series of steps. Again, these highly complicated chemical transfer steps to get to the end product. And in order to metabolize different chemicals, these steps can be slightly different. So here's two important concepts in transferring energy. First, we have reduced carbon compounds that are shuffled around to generate compounds that are required for the specific purposes. And that's really the big take-home concept there, is that the reduced carbon compounds then make up the hormones, they make up the starches and the sugars in order for the plants to be able to metabolize. We also have these phosphorylated compounds that are involved in metabolism because of different forms of sugar being more reactive than the non-phosphorylated forms. Phosphorylation, of course, just means the combination of a phosphorus molecule in whatever energy transfer is taking place. The chloroplasts, again, are kind of these little cellular units that contain the pigments that are capable of intercepting light, chlorophyll A and B, and which convert electromagnetic energy into the chemical energy first in the leaves and then in other parts of the plant. We also have some carotenoids that are formed there as well. And again, that's what we're seeing now as we see leaves change color. We have cold weather that causes chlorophyll molecules to basically die, if you will. And then the carotenoids or the flavonoids or the anthocyanin pigments are revealed, showing the true colors of the leaf, if you will. When these pigments are irradiated with light, they absorb mostly the red and blue portions of this spectrum of light. And again, think about this whole idea of light passing through a prism here, which reveals the electromagnetic spectrum, the Roy G. Biv, if you will, looking at the colors of kind of the rainbow created there, that electromagnetic spectrum. And these pigments in the leaves absorb the red and blue spectrums mostly. That includes part of the yellow too. And then they reflect much of the green portion, which is why we see leaves as being green. They're reflecting that green wavelength. And it's important to note that the different spectrums are involved in kind of different processes for the plant. For instance, the red spectrum is more used for to create energy that goes into floral and fruit production, whereas the blue spectrum is more for vegetative production. And of course, we can grow crops under artificial light. However, when we're using artificial light, we have to have sufficient spectrums from red and blue wavelengths. And you might see that in some cases they'll switch up different artificial lighting in order to provide those different spectrums. It's very important to provide a full spectrum in order for the plant to finish its life cycle. We mentioned a little bit about how light is referred to as quantity and quality. Quantity being more the photo period. Quality, we're looking at the light intensity. And another way to look at that is the photosynthetic photon flux, which is basically little micromoles of energy per second being intercepted by the leaf. Light intensity is affected by latitude, as well as altitude, as well as just what the environment is like. Are there things blocking sunlight? Is the sunlight filtered, for instance? Sunlight or natural light too. And the effects, of course, vary with different plants. The intensity can affect leaf size, shape, and color, as well as the rate of photosynthetic activity. And the way that kind of works is generally leaves tend to grow thinner and yet larger in areas under low light intensity than under high light intensity, which allows for a greater area to absorb light because they need to absorb more light. In high light intensities, though, leaves tend to be darker green because the chlorophyll cells are more densely packed together, which in turn allows for better absorption of the high amount of photons, and photons just being that light energy. Again, looking at moles per meter squared per second. And an important thing to note here, full sunlight is approximately looked at as about 2,000 moles per meter squared per second. And of course, as you guys know, we do have different species of plants adapted for different light intensities. The sun-loving plants, of course, require high light intensities. And if we look at these species of plants listed here and some of our crops like corn, potatoes, sugarcane, as well as most of our turf grasses, think about where they come from. And I'm just going to continue to kind of harp on that. Where plants come from, what types of ecosystems, what types of areas they adapted to are important to take note for the production of these crops. So if they are forming in lower latitudes with higher light intensities, then they often require higher light intensities because they've evolved and adapted to those regimes of light. Of course, we do also have plants that are adapted to grow in lower light intensities, and we often refer to these as shade-loving plants. And these first two, Dieffenbachia aglaonema, these are kind of tropical understory rainforest plants that we use as houseplants. Of course, other things, we don't have very many crops really that are shade tolerant in terms of food crops anyway. Now we do have some medicinal plants, for instance, that are shade loving, things like ginseng, golden seal, which are becoming more often cultivated in kind of forest environments. And some ornamental crops too, things like ferns, mosses. They actually require shade. They really can't grow in direct sunlight because they adapted to it, right? The majority of species, though, or crop species, as well as most species of plants, are kind of more intermediate, and they can grow well either in kind of, we say, partial sun or partial shade, or in some cases also in intense light as well. In any given plant, there is a light intensity at which photosynthesis and respiration rates are equal. And that is the light compensation point. That point is not necessarily what we're looking for. I mean, we really don't get any growth at that point, but that's kind of the point in which we begin to have growth. At that point, you have the same. You got equilibrium of carbon dioxide in respiration as well as the same amount that is used in photosynthesis. And at that point, again, we don't really have any net growth. It's beyond that light compensation point at which we tend to have growth. Interestingly enough, only about 5% of energy that comes from the sun is actually used directly into photosynthesis. A vast majority of that are non-absorbed wavelengths that are not absorbed by plants, but they are absorbed by the Earth's surface. So we have like the far red, the infrared wavelengths, which cause more heating. And some plants are actually able to absorb that. as well as the ultraviolet on the other end of the spectrum, being important in some plants, but in the majority of plants, not as important. A good portion of that is reflected as well. A good portion of it is dissipated, and then a good portion of it is used for metabolism. The rest of it, that last 5%, is used for directly in photosynthesis. And this is kind of reiterating the point here, but that light energy used for photosynthesis is absorbed by the chlorophyll molecules inside of the chloroplast, but more particularly and more specifically inside of the thylakoid membranes inside of the chloroplast. And there's just a little sketch of that for you. We have this kind of reaction center here where you can have these redox reactions where it basically releases electrons to acceptors and accepts electrons from donors. When we actually place a plant in a closed system under light, we can actually look at carbon dioxide being assimilated until that concentration reaches the equilibrium at some low value. And at some point, the carbon dioxide compensation point, there is no further assimilation until carbon dioxide is available. And really what we're saying here is just that there's a point at which plants will basically absorb all of the carbon dioxide that they can use, and then they'll stop. They won't actually be able to undergo any more photosynthesis until we have more carbon dioxide available. So in some situations, carbon dioxide can be a limiting factor in plant growth. And we'll look at some of those here in a little bit. For instance, in greenhouse crops, depends, how much acreage you have under cover in a greenhouse, but generally, if you don't have other organisms releasing carbon dioxide, then you don't have enough carbon dioxide to allow the plants to photosynthesize and actually grow. So in many greenhouse crops, they actually are injecting CO2 into the atmosphere in order to have it not be a limiting factor. And we found that increasing carbon dioxide concentration, even by 0.1%, can double photosynthetic rates of particular crops like wheat, rice, soy, and some fruits and vegetables. So how might we increase carbon dioxide in a production situation? Well, in greenhouses, we can inject it, of course, as we just mentioned, or we can also use these fans known as horizontal airflow fans that are set up kind of near the ceilings of the greenhouse, and they allow air to circulate, and it kind of causes air to be pushed down towards the plants and have more CO2 in contact with the leaves rather than being released from the greenhouse through ventilation, which might reduce their need for supplemental CO2. There are a few practices that can improve CO2 availability in some field situations as well, and that is basically just different spacings of crops, trying to alter the density and height of crop canopies in order to increase the diffusion rate of CO2 into the canopy. We can also apply crop residues or green manure crops to the soil. That can also increase CO2 levels in the atmosphere right above the soil at the plant canopy, which is where we want it. We want the plants to be able to absorb the CO2 through the leaves so that it is useful in photosynthesis. Heat also plays a role in photosynthesis and respiration. And just as a general rule of thumb there, the rate of photosynthetic activity doubles for each 18-degree increase in temperature, Fahrenheit, for many plant species up to a point. And again, that effect of temperature varies with species. If it's a warm season crop, it's going to be affected more greatly than it's going to be affected for a cool season crop. Of course, excessive temperatures can reduce photosynthetic rates, and that's just because of different changes in the metabolism of plants, often causing the stomata, those pores on the undersides of the leaves that are responsible for gas exchange, to close in order to conserve water, which in turn does not allow carbon dioxide to be released. So this stomata, again, as gas exchange, but it's not just releasing gases, it's not just releasing oxygen, it's also taking up carbon dioxide. I want to impress upon you guys that photosynthesis is really the main driver of all the metabolites in plants and all of the chemicals that we come to consume, and which makes fruits especially more flavorful. If we have reduced photosynthesis but increased respiration at high temperatures, that will lower the sugar content of fruits grown under these conditions. And I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, but anybody ever try to grow cantaloupes or other sweet melons? Yeah, go ahead and just raise your hand if you have there. I've had this happen a lot. You try to grow a cantaloupe or like a honeydew or something, and the flesh is just not as sweet. And really, that is just a result of reduced photosynthesis. That could be from many different things. It could be from shading of the crop. It could be from a insect reducing leaf area, which then causes reduced photosynthesis, or even potentially disease in some cases can do the same things. We want to try to maximize photosynthesis in order to get the best crops and the crop products available. Water also plays a huge part in the role of metabolism and photosynthesis. If we have low soil moisture and hot, drying winds, then we can have plants losing water through transpiration faster than their roots can absorb it. And in some cases, even with high soil moisture, if we still have hot, drying winds and a large leaf surface area, then you can still have more transpiration than roots are able to compensate for. So if you guys have grown like summer squash or winter squash, or even other crops that have really large leaf surface areas, then there's just so much transpiration taking place that the roots can't keep up with it, and you get temporary wilts. That's caused by the closing of the stomata, where they're trying to basically prevent water loss from the leaves, which then causes CO2 and oxygen both to be restricted, which then dramatically reduces photosynthesis. On the other end, if we have excessive soil moisture, then that can create an anaerobic condition in the soil around the roots, which really, whenever we're talking about anaerobic, we're just talking about a lack of oxygen. And in plants, we're talking about it around the roots, which then in turn reduces the ability for the roots to respire and their ability to take up minerals as well as water, which then depresses photosynthesis in the leaves. And because of this, we can actually get wilt even in situations where we have enough soil moisture, or in this case, too much soil moisture. We have to have root respiration as well in order to be able to take up water. So you see saturated soil, you often get cases where you can get wilting in plants. It often looks a little bit different in plants though. Overwatering versus underwatering. Both of them are bad. When we have sufficient water available, not too little, not too much, what I like to refer to as the Goldilocks amount, then we have transpiration and photosynthesis kind of working together and kind of at equilibrium. Whenever we have drought or too much moisture, we can have the two kind of conflicting, where it's off of equilibrium, right? There's either too much transpiration, not enough photosynthesis, or in some cases, too much photosynthesis, not enough transpiration, which causes crops to decline. In most areas, especially kind of where we are in mid-Atlantic, we have sufficient rainfall in the growing season, and therefore there's a compromise between CO2 intake and water loss, therefore is not a major issue unless we have dry spells. Generally, the plants that evolve mostly in these areas, these temperate areas, are called C3 plants because the carbon dioxide that enters the leaf is directly used to generate a 3-carbon molecule phosphoglycerate. So again, 3-carbon molecule phosphoglycerate equals C3 plants. That's the majority of plants in the world have this photosynthetic pathway. However, there are other photosynthetic pathways as well, and those we usually see as being adapted in more arid regions. They have these adaptations to help them to conserve water without inhibiting photosynthesis. So we have 2 different types of photosynthetic pathways here. We've got a C4 mechanism found in a lot of tropical grasses, including corn, sorghum, other warm season turf grasses, some of our native warm season grasses as well, and some other species. And in that case, carbon dioxide temporarily attaches to a 3-carbon organic acid, which makes a 4-carbon organic acid. Again, 4-carbon organic acid, C4. Due to an increase in carbon dioxide capture efficiency, they don't have to have as much CO2 entering the leaf, so it actually creates a more efficient photosynthetic pathway. It allows the stomata to be more tightly closed and reduce water loss in these arid environments. It's also a little bit more efficient. That's why, if you see, I mean, you notice that a lot of these grasses, they grow really fast, especially our weedy grasses, right? They just have a more efficient photosynthetic pathway, this C4 pathway. Even though they have kind of a different leaf architecture, a thinner, more narrow leaf often, they don't need as much CO2 in order to be able to conduct the same amount of photosynthesis. So therefore, they're able to grow quicker than a lot of other plants. The other pathway is known as the CAM pathway, and we often see this in desert plants such as succulents and cacti. They take stored water to keep the plant cool in the day, and instead they often are respiring at night instead, so that they have less water loss. So the difference here is that the CAM attaches CO2 to a 3-carbon organic acid at night instead of at day. So CO2 is held on to that acid until the light is available and released to follow the normal photosynthetic pathway. So they don't necessarily have faster growth, but it just allows them to hold water longer, which, as you might imagine, is an excellent adaptation for arid areas. So it's funny because photosynthesis, of course, influences plant growth, but that occurs in conjunction with respiration. So plant growth influences the net and total rate of photosynthesis in leaves and the total canopy, as long as all the other environmental factors are constant. And as a single leaf develops, its photosynthetic rates rise with the expansion of the leaf. And when it reaches its full expansion, it becomes a source leaf because the carbohydrate synthesized in that leaf is then in excess of what the leaf itself needs. So at that point, it becomes a source for sugars for other plant tissues. And then they kind of export that and move that to other plant parts such as roots, fruits, and seeds, which in turn are sink tissues. So know the difference between a source and sink tissue. Really, only leaves are source tissues, except in some desert plants where the leaves have been modified to form kind of different mostly in cacti. If you guys look at cacti, they don't have leaves. Instead, they have these spines, and all that photosynthetic area is in the stem. So in some cases, we have a little bit different anatomy there, but generally leaves are sources, other tissues are sinks. Let's move on to respiration now, and it's a little bit different than photosynthesis, but they have to work in conjunction with each other in order to be able to get plant growth. Respiration extracts that energy that is stored in the plant sugars like glucose and other carbohydrates, and then converts it to other forms used to synthesize the biochemicals that are responsible for conducting other forms of tissues, other products for the plant, other metabolites, other chemicals. And respiration involves the transfer of energy to ATP to ADP, which that is, kind of chemical formula is written here. We've got glucose combined with oxygen combined with ADP plus phosphate or phosphorylate to get carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So really, respiration in a way is kind of the reverse of photosynthesis, at least when we're looking at carbon dioxide and carbohydrate being produced and released. Carbon dioxide is released by respiration and then can once again be used in photosynthesis, which completes the carbon cycle both in the plant and really across the ecosystem. The first step of respiration is glycolysis, and that's the conversion of glucose to a 3-carbon pyruvic acid, also known as pyruvate, which takes place in the cell's cytoplasm. The second step takes place in the cell's mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, and that is called a tricarboxylic acid, a TCA cycle, which involves several different reactions using acids and these 3 different carboxyl groups, hence tricarboxylic acid. And I'm just going to skip over this, but if you want to kind of examine this, it's just is looking at glycolysis and that TCA cycle, which really is just an important aspect of respiration in the plant. So much of the reducing power in the original glucose molecule is retained in NADH and FADH2, and then the nucleotide molecules being oxidized to generate ATP, getting to the third step of respiration, which again is another electron transport system involving a bunch of different cyclic reactions. The big thing to know here is that molecular oxygen is the final electron acceptor and H2O is the final product. So what we have basically in respiration taking place in the leaves and respired, release of gases of oxygen and water vapor. And that really is what drives the growth of plants. You can't just have photosynthesis, you also have to have respiration. You have to have the release of the gases that are produced in photosynthesis. And on this slide, big thing I want to point out here is just this cycle in respiration of the NADH being oxidized and reduced through electron carriers. So we just basically have a chain of oxidation and reduction taking place, moving electrons through these different carriers until we get to the final electron carrier, which is then releasing the oxygen and water vapor through the leaf. It's estimated that nearly 60% of the energy in a glucose molecule is conserved in ATP production. And ATP is that energy currency, kind of that little, that part of that electron reduction and oxidation. And it's used in all living organisms, not just in plants. it's transported to other places in the cell and used in a wide variety of other chemical reactions. Net photosynthesis is what we look at as the amount of photosynthates produced above the amount that is required by the plant itself. And then any accumulation of these photosynthesis the photosynthesis products in plants can only occur after the plant's own needs for these products have been met. Of course, respiration continues to occur after plant materials are harvested. We can see that, for instance, in tomatoes ripening after they're harvested. And often, again, we harvest green tomatoes and then they continue to respire. And especially when exposed to ethylene gas, that respiration is increased, causing the fruit to continue to ripen. And this is really important to note in terms of the shelf life, storage, and storability of crop products used for resale. And really, we need to try to look at minimizing respiration in order to lengthen shelf life of things like apples, for instance. And what's a common thing that we do in apples in order to reduce that respiration? Anybody eaten an apple lately? I bet Tom has, right? Apple a day, right?
Not quite.
Well, sorry. We wax apples, right? Or a lot of times commercial growers will wax apples, giving it that shiny appearance for one, but also causing that respiration to be reduced and the shelf life of the final product to be extended. All right, so that's the end of that chapter. Anybody have any questions about photosynthesis and respiration? Megan, you look like you have a question. No? Okay. All right, so again, I'm just going to remind you one more time. I'm going to give you guys just a participation grade for getting on to the discussion board and signing up for your crop so that hopefully soon we can move on with that project. Still only got 6 people that have responded to that. For those of you that have done that, thank you. For those of you that haven't, please do that as soon as possible. Otherwise, you won't get that participation grade. The deadline is tonight at 11:59 p.m. After that, you won't get a participation grade for that. You'll lose some points. That's just going to be a little part of the project. And we'll move on. It's a very important project for the rest of the semester and an important part of your grade. So again, if you need suggestions or you need me to assign a crop to you, I'll be happy to do that.
Today's the deadline for that. Yeah, for the participation. Yeah.
If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. With that being said, signing off. You guys have a great day. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next Monday.
Okay. Bye. Have a good weekend.